Hello, viewers. Welcome once again to your very own STAVKＡ podcast. Today we have with us Colonel Ashutosh Kale sir, who has served in the Indian Army for more than 2 decades and is a published author. In today's episode, we'll talk about his early life, his time in the Indian Army, his days as commanding officer of 3 Grenadiers, his writing process, and we'll understand about the 2 books that he has written so far. In today's episode, we'll also talk about his upcoming book Rambo, which is based on the life of Major Sudhir Walia sir. We hope you enjoy this episode. Jai Hind. Thank you so much, sir. Welcome to STAVKA podcast.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It's a
So,
pleasure and honor to be here.
absolutely, sir. It's a pleasure for us as well. So, sir, we'll start and we'd like to talk to you about your early life, your childhood. You are a third generation army officer. So, how was life there?
Firstly, I just want to wish our listeners a Jai Hind. And, the Kargil War days are generally here now. And today, in fact, is the anniversary of a hero much before Kargil, that is Colonel Hushar Paramveer Chakra, who commanded my battalion during, and he fought during the Jarpal War, for which he got the Paramveer Chakra against 35 frontier forces. I commanded the same battalion years later. So I'm the proud commanding officer of a very illustrious and a proud battalion. And then I led them into the United Nations, where we met an officer from 35 Frontier Force so many years later. And that's another story which I must tell you someday. It's an amazingly romantic story, how you meet uh, a counterpart, an adversary, years later on neutral ground in the United Nations, under the United Nations flag, and how the two adversaries respect each other for what happened so many years back. It's another story. I'll tell you that. It's another episode altogether.
Sure, sir.
A very
Absolutely.
fascinating episode.
Yeah.
So I'm a third generation officer. Yes, my father was a gunner. He's also an ex-NDA like me. My grandfather was in the Gwalior State Forces. He saw action during the Second World War. He was in Italy with 4th Battalion Gwalior Rifles, which went down to Italy during that time as part of the British forces. And fascinating stories. He also took part in the Hyderabad police action, for this amalgamation of Hyderabad into the Union of India. So I've grown up on stories like this of shikars and hunts and wars, and it kind of fascinated me. So joining the army was never an option. I mean, I just grew up into that, and I joined the NDA, and of course, then got commissioned into the Grenadiers. For a brief while, I had a romantic delusion of joining the 61st Cavalry because I used to play polo, and I played polo at the national level. I've taken part in equestrian championships, so I wanted to join the 61st Cavalry and the Armored Corps. But I suppose life had other designs for me. Whatever happens, happens for the best. So I joined the Grenadiers and then went on to command the 3rd Grenadiers. And then, of course, was the center commander under the Grenadier Regimental Center. Had a stint in the United Nations with the battalion. We were in Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Horn of Africa. A very exciting tenure for us along the Red Sea. And then I came back and relinquished my uniform, took a premature, joined the corporate world. For about 14, 15 years, I was part of the corporate world. I was the CEO of Imagica, which is a theme park of Mumbai. Was on the board of directors. Before that, I was with Go Air. Then before that, I was with Leela's. Then, of course, I was with Imagica for almost about 10 years. And then I decided to kind of go into other things and kind of experience. I always live on an edge, and anything routine kind of bores me. So when I was at the helm of my career in the army, my postmates are all principal staff officers and lieutenant generals today in the army. I kind of quit, I joined the corporate world, started off from ground zero. became a CEO, quit, started off all over again. I was doing some projects, heritage projects in Himachal, and I was looking after the restoration of a 300-year-old fort of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which is in Amritsar. And up there, I met a friend, and today I'm on an entrepreneurial journey. I started a chain of cafes and a fine dining restaurant. And in the course of all this, I started writing books because I thought I made it my mission to kind of bring heroes to light and give them the honor that they deserve and let their stories be heard. So, this is my third book. The project came to me from the publisher and he wanted me to write. It took me some time to uh, gather facts. In fact, I took my time because my subjects always come with deep research. My books always come with a lot of research. So I need to have a commitment to myself and to the readers that I will deliver. So that takes time for me to kind of build up that commitment. So after I had got my facts and I knew that I wanted to do the story, of course, it was an inspiring story. Sudhir was about 4 courses junior to me in NDA. I'm from the 68th course, he's from the 72nd course. I didn't know him personally, but in NDA, you do cross paths once in a while. He was from a separate battalion, of course. So that's how it happened. He was a second termer when I was kind of passing up. So, yeah, that's how it happened. And then, but the story is very inspiring. Uh, he also got posted briefly for a while in IMA as an instructor when I was there. It was a very brief period, but I just met him casually. I think. Yeah. So that's my story and that's my life, short and simple.
Yes, sir. So I would like to take you back to your early days, right? When you were preparing for SSB and you were in the process of joining the NDA. So how was that phase for you? Preparing for SSB, going there, giving interviews, and
I must say
eventually,
it's like any other boy who's preparing for NDA.
yeah.
A lot of anxiety, a lot of tension. I gave my SSB from Bhopal. Um, I I didn't clear NDA in my first attempt, despite every effort that I had put in. And then, of course, I cleared it in my second attempt, and I also cleared it in my third attempt. And by the time the results come out, there is also another exam around. So I was in Delhi, I remember, and my father was very disappointed that I didn't clear. Luckily, he didn't put too much pressure on me. But then I cleared my second attempt. And SSB, I remember, there were a few of my father's colleagues who had some experience of the SSB, so they kind of sat down and talked to me. But one basic thumb rule that they told me was just be yourself, be chill, and just be confident. It doesn't matter actually in the SSB, even later. I've had my friends and my postmates who were part of the SSB boards. So this actually goes out for all aspirants that as long as you're confident and you have the fire in your belly, it really doesn't matter if you know English, you don't know English, what language you're speaking in. As long as your thoughts are clear, as long as you have the confidence, and then as long as you have the fire in your belly, there's nothing that can stop. Finally, if you don't make it, it's not because you haven't qualified a particular bar or crossed a particular bar. It's just that the army and the services have a very peculiar qualitative requirement, and you probably don't fit into that qualitative requirement. We've had a lot of people who didn't qualify, but who went on to be great successes in life in whatever fields they did. So you're not a failure. Never think yourself that. All the best for everyone who wants to.
Yes, sir. So can we say that if by chance you're not able to qualify in the SSB, it's just that somehow you're not fit in the requirements that the army wants or the Indian Armed Forces wants, but it's not going to say that you're not like capable. Can we
Exactly,
say that?
exactly, absolutely. Because they have a set of parameters,
Yeah.
and you need to fit those parameters. It's just like everyone can't end up becoming a doctor, or everyone can't even becoming a surgeon, or everyone can't be a pianist, right? You need
Right.
to have something different to be a pianist, to be a musician, to be a doctor, to be a surgeon. Even when you join the medicine, there are some people who are very good surgeons, but there's some people who are very good radiologists. So it's a different set of skills altogether. Just because someone has not become a good surgeon doesn't mean he's not a good doctor, right? He's still a good doctor, but he's just not that. He's not just not a surgeon. Similarly, in the army, if you offer the services, if you have not cleared the interview, it's not because you're a failure. Never think of it like that. It's just because you have not. There's a set of parameters, and you don't fit into those parameters. But there's a whole life waiting for you, and you will do well in whatever field you choose to go thereafter. Like I said, I can give you so many examples of people, and I keep meeting so many people in Mumbai. When I was in the corporate world, I used to meet them who didn't qualify, but who've gone on to become exceptional leaders and CEOs, and in their fields. And they always said that I had appeared for the SSB, I didn't clear. I went twice, I didn't clear. I became overage. But that hasn't stopped them from achieving great successes in life. So it's just that you don't fit. And there are ways of being a patriot apart from being in the uniform. If you're a good citizen and you do your job diligently, and you feel for the country, and you kind of support whatever initiatives need to be supported, I think you're a good citizen and a good patriot. So every hero doesn't have to wear a uniform.
Yes. So how was your time in India? It,
Ah,
it's always bittersweet.
it's very, very
Yeah.
bittersweet. So like I said, I was from the 68 course. Way back today, times have changed.
Yeah.
So NDA was a mad, mad house, extremely exhilarating, heart thumping, gripping. When I look back now, it's of course very nostalgic. When I was there in my junior terms, I hated it to my fingertips. Most of us did, because you were at the brunt of everything you were getting. And you didn't realize why it is happening. They were trying to toughen you up. And the process of toughening, like the process of making steel, is always difficult. You have to go through fire, right? You have
Yeah.
to get hampered and hit by the hammer a couple of times.
Right.
So the steel, I'm sure, doesn't like it when it is getting hammered out like that. So that is how it is in India, and you really don't know what's happening. But yeah, second term was really first term we were in Bhorpudi, and then second term onward you were in India, and you didn't know what had hit you. You didn't have mobiles in those days, so everything had to be done through letters. So once in a while you would write home. In my case, I used to write to my father, and my father being a service officer, he was still serving then, and he would send me back these huge letters of Gyan, which I've again found uh, not very good in the circumstances that I was. So I stopped writing. I said, I'll deal with my own issues myself. And that's how you kind of toughen up, right? In life, you need to know that you got to cut the bondage sometimes and kind of stand on your own feet. And people from outside can never help you. You have to help yourself. And then gradually you get accustomed to the life, and you get into the colors. And it builds on you till the time that 35 years pass and you can't get it out of your system.
Yes. So isn't that like a biggest realization for any human being that nobody's coming to help? You have to figure out things yourself at some point in your life.
Yeah, and then more so in a place like NDA or in a
Yeah.
training institute like India. That one is the biggest lesson that comes to you. How to survive under pressure, how to thrive under pressure. Not only survive, but how to thrive and how to excel under pressure. And at the end of the day, you are your own strength, and your mind is your greatest asset and your greatest weakness. So if you have it in you, you will come out victorious. And if you don't have it in you, every support that you have will still pull you down.
Yes, absolutely. Sir, any stories that you would like to share from your NDA days or your IMA days?
So I must tell you a very peculiar story, one from NDA and one from IMA. NDA, when I started, we were cadets and there would be this constant outdoors and running around. And I remember because I was playing polo, I used to go for these long polo training sessions, and I used to come back really tired. The moment I came back, they would announce cross country practice, and I would just be back from 3 hours of playing polo or riding, and your legs would be kind of shivering at that point of time, and then they would take you for a cross country run. Um, so that I think is a very memorable memory of mine, where I am running cross country, going out for swimming, uh, immediately after riding. And of course, we went on to do a lot of equestrian events those days in Bombay and Delhi, even Patiala. And those friends that I made in those days have stood with me for all these years. Like I said, some of my postmates today are deputy chiefs. The DG Infantry is my postmate. I have an army commander who's my postmate. Very amazing, and very proud to see these guys, whom you front rolled with, and you probably got smacked with, and got hit with, and you cried and you cheered and you ran. The same guys are today, wearing a sword and a baton and standing there, so senior up. It feels amazing. So that is what is about NDA. But I must tell you that, I had lost my bike in my second term in IMA. And when I lost my bike, and if you lose your bike as a cadet, that's the worst thing that can ever happen to you, because then you are running around all the time. So there was this friend of mine called Rupinder Hans. I used to call him so Rodney Shelby Hans. So he had also lost his bike, and we were both neighbors. One day someone came and flicked the bike. So all of that term, we would keep running around, both of us. And if you don't have a squad, you'll get punished. So we used to hide behind trees and wait for the drill starts to not be there. And then we would sneak and take the shortcuts to our classes. Because otherwise, if you didn't have a bike, you would have had to spend, probably you would have missed out on 5 toasts and, one omelette that you didn't want to. You had to have those 5 toasts and yet reach the class. So there used to be one particular wall where there was a hole, and we used to crawl under that, looking around for getting ambushed. And when the coast was clear, we used to crawl through that hole and reach our class. Years later, I got posted as an instructor in the Indian Military Academy. And I went to that same place and I found the hole there, and I found 2 GCs emerging from that hole. So while I hadn't passed on that route to anyone, that route obviously was passed on generation to generation. And someone was still using that route, the hole in the wall, to get to his class, because he probably had lost his bike. And then I asked him, I said, "Have you lost your bike?" He said, "Yes, sir, I've lost my bike. Someone's stolen it. So I use this to go to my class." So I looked the other way and I said, "Carry on, we are friends," because I did the same thing 10 years back.
How do you feel, sir, as an instructor, watching that scenario? You have to
Oh,
be
it
strict at the same time, but
yeah.
you can't stop.
Back,
Yeah.
still, you kind of remember the scars on your back that you got rolling over the stones. Three of my cadets, my gentlemen GCs, joined my regiment. They're all brigadiers now. Suchil Nimbalkar got commissioned into 18 Grenadiers. He got a VRC during the Tiger Hill attack. And he came and spent 3 days with me after the Kargil war. It felt so amazing and so proud. And he said that, "Sir, when we were going in for the attack, I used to take these leadership series in IMA and tell them, what leadership is all about. I was a young captain then, and whatever I study material I had, I would probably learn from those a little bit of experience. But that boy was actually into war, into Kargil. And he said, I used to remember those leadership lessons that you would take in the Chetwood Hall, telling us that, the true grit of a leader is when you are charging into a machine gun and you don't look over your shoulders and you have 10 men still following you and you know they're following you to death. So he said, I remember those words when I was going in for those attacks and it felt really good. So somewhere, I think you've done a good job as an instructor, proved and you tempered steel all over again. Boys it together.
Right. Sir, after finishing training in IMA, you got posted to 3 Grenadiers itself, or was it a
No, I
different
was
unit?
commissioned into 5 Grenadiers. I spent
Okay.
years in 5 Grenadiers, and then later on, I got shifted to 3rd Grenadiers, where I commanded, and then ultimately we went into the United Nations. Like I said earlier, we were in Ethiopia, Eritrea, the Horn of Africa. A wonderful, exciting tenure, which also formed the backdrop of my second book. My regiment was involved in a campaign in 1868 into Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. And under the British flag, they had gone in for a campaign to ransack and burn the kingdom of Abyssinia. And 2nd Grenadiers was part of that campaign in 1868. Years later, when I got posted in the United Nations, I happened to be in the same area. My camps were exactly in the same areas where the campaigning force had camped 100 years back. It gave me goosebumps. And then I started doing a lot of research. I found the grave of a gentleman called Colonel Alexander Dunn, Victoria Cross. I didn't know he was at that time when I visited the grave. In a small dialect graveyard in Ethiopia, just below the mountains. When I started doing research for my book much later, I found that he was Captain Alexander Dunn, who had led the charge of the Light Brigade. That famous poem of Lord Tennyson, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. It's one of the most famous cavalry charges in the history of warfare. And he had led that charge. He survived that. He was a Canadian. Then he came back and got a Victoria Cross for that charge. Then he became a colonel and he led another battalion in the Abyssinian campaign. So I found his grave there. Then there was a gentleman called Captain Speedy, who was born in Kanpur, got educated in India and England, saw action in the Northwest Frontier province and in Punjab, and then became a mercenary and was working with the Ethiopian monarch, king. And that's when the British forces wanted him, so he joined them as an interpreter because not many people knew the Tigray language. And he was part of the campaign. And then after the campaign, he took a batch of Sikh soldiers to Malaysia and established the first police outpost in Malaya with Sikhs. And that's how Sikhs landed up in Malaysia. So today in Malaysia, you have a lot of Sikhs. And those Sikhs, the origin of the Sikhs is Captain Speedy and his platoon of Sikhs soldiers from the Abyssinian campaign. So very fascinating. I went down to London to Prince Albert Victoria Museum. I went down into the British Archives. Got a lot of history. There's nothing available in India. I went into Addis Ababa, into their archives, and then created this entire story. So it's a very fascinating story. 90% of it is true. I also tried to do military horror, because I wanted to push the envelope. So parts of the story are true. I mean, 80% of the story are true. There are only parts of the story which are fiction, where I've added the horror part, and it became a new genre actually, period military horror. So that's what my second book, and then the first came with that.
Yes. So you have to take some creative liberty, writing a book, right? Make it even more interesting. Is that the idea behind it?
So I'll tell you how I've dealt with Rambo, and I would like to focus on that. See, when I grew up, uh, you know, I don't know if you had the privilege, but when I was growing up, there were these commando comics that we used to read, and which really were very inspiring. The stories of the Second World War, the Germans and the Britishers, the French, and fighting and all that. And I grew up on those stories. Unfortunately, I never found parallel literature in the Indian context. Much later, when I read books, I also found books on military subjects, which were very fascinating and very well written by American and British authors and European authors. But again, in the Indian context, there was nothing like this. What was unfortunately written were laborious military history books. Now, I am from the same fraternity, so I can tell you that we are very good at writing reports. We are taught to write reports, sit reps, and reports. And most of us, when we write a book, we convert that report into a thicker report. So it actually becomes a fat report. It's really not creative writing, it's a fat report. So, books like What Happened in the Sino Indian Campaign and the debacle of this and that. So it's basically report writing, right? It's a reference book. It's a historical book. It's not really a classic book which a young boy in a off the street will pick it up to read. You kind of writing you require. You require writing that captivates you, that fascinates you, that you find interesting, that you just pick up naturally, organically, and start reading. That's what happens in a novel. That's what happens with creative writing. That's what happens with half a dozen other fiction books that you read. So I wanted to bring out those kind of stories, that kind of writing. Also, most of us have stories, but we never get them into writing. We can talk about them in the evening over a glass of rum, but we never actually write those stories, right? So I wanted to write those stories down on paper, my own experience as a young officer, the heat and dust of operations and what happened. So, yes, there is a certain, I won't say creative licensing for this story. So, I have created the story, I've got the narrative, and then I have given it a creative and a cinematic flair. That is a different style of writing. I've not necessarily given it a creative license, but I've given it a cinematic flair. So I have written the book scene by scene. If there is a battle happening, if there is a fight happening, I've gone scene by scene because I have been in the same areas. I've operated in the same geography. I've gone through similar operations. So I know exactly what happens and how it happens. I've put myself, I'm seeing the operation through Sudhir's eyes, standing there in that house or on the Pir Panjal range where I have stood there myself uh, 100 times over. And I'm looking around, and that's how I write the story, and that's how it comes across. So it's not like a report, it's like you're watching a film, you're reading it cinematically. So that's how I've done. Some places, conversation and certain things, of course, you have to create, which are fictional, because it's not possible to create an entire book with, entire conversations in Replit after 30 years. So you'll just get the narrative of the person, but the rest has to be created. So that part you can say is part of creative licensing.
Yes, sir. So I think it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is also important to do that so that the book caters to a wider audience. Otherwise,
Exactly.
people who are interested a lot, then will be able to read the military history books if it is not done that way.
Absolutely. When you write a story like you write for a military hero like Sudhir Walia, the forces and the people in uniform, at least most of them would know the story. You need to reach out to the man who has no inkling of what the army is, or he has no understanding of it. So you have to simplify it to a degree where he's He doesn't get burdened by jargon and words. Of course, to keep the excitement in, you will have to pep in. Like if you see an OTT serial on some war movie or some spy action series, there are certain kind of jargons which are used, right?
Yeah.
And that creates that excitement. So you will have to put that in certain amount. Maybe if he gets his absolute novice, he might have to Google one or two words. If I'm saying an LMG or an MMG, he might not understand that, and he need to Google it. But otherwise, the rest of the narrative, at least he'll get it clear in his mind if it just runs like a story. So the book is meant not for people in the services, but more for young adults and people out there who need to get inspired and you need to hear the story. So you have to simplify the army versions. And that is why I said I have to break away from the report writing kind of where which is heavily inundated with army jargon and uh, army contextualizing, and bring it down and break it down into a civilian context and civilian contextualizing and scene building where it feels like a movie, it feels like easy to grasp and easy to digest. uh, so that has been my endeavor. That's how all my books are.
Yes. Sort of like the a person who is reading the book needs to be sort of enamored by the mystery around things which are happening, but also relate to the person about whom you're going to write.
And he needs to get transported.
Yes.
You might be sitting in Bangalore, but I need to transport you into the Pir Panjal.
Right.
So I have to hit your senses. You need to smell, hear, feel, touch. You need to feel like you're walking in Pir Panjal and you're seeing there is snow, there is something biting your ankle. You, s- when you walk, there is the smell of the earth or apples. If it is it's the apple harvesting season in Kashmir. So you need to create that kind of an environment, that kind of all your senses need to be kind of feeling it. That's when you get a 360-degree experience, right?
Right.
If I just say that, you went and you fired and you came back, it's very dry. But if I tell you that you went in and there's an orchard and you could feel the smell of the apples and there was dry grass crunching beneath your boot, your leg scraped against a rock or a shin, yeah, scraped against a tree, that's when you actually get the feel. What's the early morning like? Is the birds twittering? Is there a grasshopper jumping across? Even as you're firing, probably there's a grasshopper jumping across your barrel, which happens, right? Or you might fire into the trees and you might hear a flap of wings and you might find a feather coming down. So that kind of thing. Or the echoes reverberating in the stones when there's random gunfire. Happens. There's smoke. So all that needs to be created. So that's how creative writing comes through. That's why this is different from any other book that you will see.
Right. Sir, I want to like take you back to the your commissioning days, right? So where was your sort of first posting? Was it Siachen?
No, no. My first posting was Dakshai,
Okay.
and this is very near to where I'm staying. It's part of the Shimla Hills, old cantonment, where I was commissioned. It's a very small cantonment next to Kasoli, uh, and it was a cantonment which again was, since it was such an old cantonment, it had a lot of ghost stories, I remember. And as a young officer, I had to go and do these guard checks at 2 o'clock at night, and it would be raining and there would be no one around. And I'd be horrified to walk across because I had to cross 2, 3 graveyards, old cemeteries, with all these ghost stories floating around as a young officer. Can you imagine a scene where you're walking on a road? It's 2:30 at night. It's in the mountains. There is a little bit of a haze. There is a drip, drip, drip of little water, and there's a graveyard next to you, and there is a bulb which is going like this, a street light, and you're walking by yourself because you're going to do a guard check. So I still remember those days of Dakshai, very fun days. Then my, of course, second posting was Siachen, and I was there at a place called Bhagosha, which is 19,000 feet, subsector west. which later on those areas came under the part of the war which took place in Kargil. And that's how I could recreate this entire chapter on the Siachen Glacier in the book. And I could recreate that entire chapter because I've lived that life. I know exactly what it feels to walk in that snow, to live in that snow, to survive in that snow. How your toothpaste solidifies, how, you're probably holding onto the rope when you're crapping because you don't want to fall off into a 1,000 feet gully down below you. um, how you take a bath and what psychological problems you have and how do you keep your men motivated. So you have these fascinating stories, and that's how I've been able to create uh, every part of the book because I have lived in those areas myself and I felt it for myself.
Right. So, how was Siachen?
I was a young officer, so as a young officer, you're highly motivated and glamorized. So Siachen for me was very fascinating. I had a camera in those days, ACFA 135, and I used to go around clicking. And I think I have over 500 photographs of that time. Everywhere I went, I carried my camera. And I went out on long range patrols. We had 3 posts. I had 3 posts under me, and I used to visit those posts. I was in the company headquarters. Orders would come through me through the battalion headquarters. We wouldn't have logistics coming up for days during winters. The letters used to be read out on the radio set. As a young officer, you would get some letters, and the adjutant would say, "What do you want? Do you want me to read out that letter?" And the entire network is listening on. So you said, "No, no, just tell me what is the name. From where has it come? You don't even tell me the name. Just tell me the location. I'll know. Rest, I'll come down after a month or 2 months and I'll read the letter. Don't read out the letter." So those were the kind of times. Or probably when you got a letter or a newspaper, you would probably read it 10 times over. I would even read the fine print because you wouldn't get another newspaper for the next 15 days. That's how you kept yourself busy. So it's a great place for testing your psychology and testing your own solitude. There's so much time to think. You think and think and think and think because you have no one. You're just on the post with 10 men. There is no one whom you can really talk to. You can speak to the men, but as an officer, there's only that much you can share. So it's a great place to be in, and I think it's a great place to toughen you up and also to understand who you are. So I found it extremely fascinating and extremely challenging.
Right. So, any operations that you conducted there? Was there anything?
No, not really operations. We were not in a place where operations were being conducted. See, Siachen is a place where you're sitting and the Pakis on the other side. So you're not really conducting operations. There's more a fight with nature every day and the snow, and survival is more about that. I remember a time, and this really happened. I must tell you this interesting story. So when we were getting changed over, so there was a valley, and the people had to cross this valley and then come up to the post. And the Pakis used to look down over this valley. So we used to conduct this movement at night so that the Pakis could not observe. Because every time you kind of walked in, they would start firing artillery shells, which would be these airburst shells. Because there you don't have impact shells, there's no ground impact. So you have aerial bursts happening with the timed fuses, the bursts, and you have pellets coming down. So when this changeover was happening and there was this battalion who was coming up and they were replacing my troops and I was to go down after my time at the post was over. And some of my boys had gone down to bring this new lot of people up. They had walked up for 2 days, and as they were coming up, they came into the valley. It was supposed to be a cloudless night, and the cloud cover cleared and the moon came up, and it was like a searchlight in the valley. And you could see this 15, 20 people walking up, and it was like you switched on a floodlight, on a basketball court. And suddenly the parties were also alert and they started firing. And moment they started firing, these people were first time under fire. So they all went to ground and they kind of, as per training, they all started lying on the ground because that's what they say. That moment you have artillery firing, you go down on the ground because the sharpnel kind of go at a 30-degree arc. So if you lie on the floor or on the ground, they will kind of, but not, they didn't realize that it was air burst and not really ground impact. So it was coming from top. So you can't lie down there. So I saw two of these guys getting injured, and then I said, I can't watch this happen, and I'll probably not be able to face myself for the rest of my life. So I wanted to go down and pull them up, and I went down into my hut, wore my crampons. I was already wearing my boots, and I came out, and there was this Havaldar who was there with me, old guy. He must have been in his 35, 37. I was just about 23, 24, 20 years my senior. And he looked at me and he said, "Saab, मैं आपको अकेला नहीं जाने दूंगा. अगर आप जाओगे तो मैं साथ जाऊंगा." I think that has been one of the finest moments of my life, when there is a man who's got a family and kids, comes from a humble background but wants to just kind of lay down his life with you. I had nothing. I was a young officer. I was not married. I came from a decent background. And you are young and you have that fire in your belly and you're not thinking of the consequences. But there was this man who had everything. He had a responsibility and he said, "I will not let you go down by yourself. If you die, we die together." So I sat down on a rock. I still remember there's this massive rock. I sat down on the rock to savor that moment because I said, this is probably the richest moment that I will ever have in my life. And no amount of riches will ever give me a moment like this. And I still remember that over the years. After that, we both went down and we yelled at them, we abused them, and we got them going. And then there was one guy whose back had got injured because a splinter had kind of hit him and sprouting like a fountain. Another guy who's injured his leg. So we carried this guy between us. We were acclimatized. We had spent about 6 months there. Someone carried the other soldier and we kind of managed to get him up. But such is life and such is the way things happen. And that's why it's moments like these that you say it's been worth it. And that guy
Right.
died, the soldier with the back injury. And all night we were on the radio set. The doctor was telling us, we didn't have a doctor. And he kept telling us what injections to give him. So you as a young officer are sitting there and kind of putting in those injections in the best way you can. First he died and then next day morning we had to drag the body down to a place where the helicopters took him. So yeah, that was one memory that I have. The second was we were caught in an avalanche and we kind of survived that. So I got that part of the experience also in my book, where we had gone into the avalanche rescue. So somewhere when you write a story, your personal experiences do tend to creep in. So
Yes,
do
sir.
the emotions.
So how you mentioned, right, that uh, he had an injury and he passed away, he got martyred. How does that change you as a young officer when you witness something like
We don't use the word martyred because it's not for a religious
that?
cause.
Okay,
It's for fallen
right.
hero.
Yeah, fallen heroes. Yeah,
Martyr is only when you die for a religious cause.
right.
So yeah, it does affect you very, very. It does affect you very, very deeply, especially when you see it happening for the first time. You say you're young and you have these global romantic intuitions about you and the delusion. But when you actually see it happening and you see this man dying and you're holding his hand and his life is going away from him, it probably changes you like nothing ever will. And it does impact you. And then, while it also kind of infuses you with another kind of inspiration, to be that much more stronger and that much more resolute, that much more fearsome. But it also kind of teaches you on the fragility of life and how you need to live your life every day to the fullest and live it like there is no tomorrow, because life is so fragile. Anything happen in the blink of an eye. So both those things happen, and I think it's like, how do I say, like if you go for a cremation, I heard someone say, and I think it's the truth. When you go for a cremation, and at that moment when you are at the cremation, inside the cremation ground, I think that's the moment when you're closest to God, because there are so many thoughts that go through you when you see that body lying there and getting cremated. And you think that we keep running over so many things. We keep lying and fighting and stealing and holding, and it all comes down to that. So you promise yourself that I'll be a better man, right? And I will not do anything like this. And you actually get zoned out for a point of time when you're there. There are these multiple thoughts that come to you. And that's how you walk out of the cremation ground till the first phone call comes and you again snap back to reality. Uh, so that's exactly the kind of zoning out happens when you are in moments like this. There is a certain degree of piousness, there's a certain degree of godliness, deep introspection, and profound learnings and effects that happen.
Right. So, might be a little unrelated, but then uh, can we say that those kind of experiences that you had sort of like enhances you spiritually? Can we say
It
something
does.
like that?
It does. That's why you'll find a lot of people in the services are very spiritual in some time or the other.
Right.
I just had a friend of mine who released a book on yoga and spiritualism. So there are a lot of us who kind of go through such situations, and we become very, very uh, deep rooted in our beliefs and in our. Funnily, like they always said that there is no religion in the army, and follow the religion of the troops. When you are under pressure, when you are in Kashmir, when death stares you in the face, you are clinging on to every kind of belief that will help you survive, whether as an officer. So every Peer Baba Mazar is important to you. It doesn't matter whether it's a Muslim Peer and you're a Hindu or you're a Brahmin. You will go and pray there. In the valley, across, I have seen not one, but across regiments and units, that people give up eating non-veg on a Friday because it is the Peer Day in the valley. So that's how profoundly, it kind of affects you. There are people who don't drink in the valley. I'm talking about the services, because Peer Baba ka din hai. And because there it is a fight for survival every day. And you don't want to antagonize anything that will jeopardize your life or the lives of your men. So everything is sacred, everything. Religion doesn't matter. Survival does.
Right. Sir, so coming to your tenures in Northeast as well and in J&K, could you tell us a little bit about your operations there? And
So
one in Northeast and one in
yeah,
J&K.
so we did conduct operations subsequently in. I spent long years in J&K operations. Like I said, I was there conducting operations as a young officer, as a captain, and as a major. I was also there in J&K as a staff officer, where I was not only conducting, but I was planning operations for brigade side forces, gathering information, intelligence, scrutinizing intelligence, passing on those intelligence reports, assessing situations. So I've seen it from both ends. Similarly, when I was posted in Nagaland and Manipur. So those were the days of the ceasefire with the NSC and IM in Nagaland. But we did intense amount of patrolling in those jungles. Uh, We had confrontation with the NSC and IM also a couple of times. Well, I wouldn't like to go into the details of some of those operations, but they were very, very challenging times. Very different. Kashmir and Nagaland and Manipur are absolutely different entities. And I spent long years in Kashmir as I did in Nagaland and Manipur. But interesting, challenging, and a very different set of dynamics. Extremely different set of dynamics.
So how is militancy sort of different in Northeast and J&K? Can we draw a parallel there?
Militancy in J&K was has wavered from being a religiously led movement to a non-religious led movement, but being led by elements from outside the country, like the Afghans, the foreign militants who were there, Afghans, Pakistanis, even some international other countries, like we had people at a point of time from Turkey, and we have had reports of people being there from Iran. You know? So there were those kind of elements there, and this is all about jihad, about the religious war, about how the kafirs are kind of killing the Muslims. It's an absolutely wrong narrative, and it's gone through various shades of azadi to independence to religious war to jihad, to other elements, to even the caliphate wanting to get itself established, which has nothing to do with India or Pakistan, but a new caliphate wanting to be established, which is also there in my book, where it went from green flags to black flags. At a point of time, the dead bodies of militants, which used to be wrapped in green flags, started getting wrapped in black flags. So it's those kind of things, highly, highly politicized. Everyone kind of putting their fingers in for survival. The entire political lot over there had continued to survive on this politics and the politics of jihad and the uncertainty for all these years. That's how they got created. That's how they survived. The dynamics in the Northeast were totally different. The dynamics in the Northeast were very the alignment with the tribe, the Naga identity, especially for Nagaland, the fight for Greater Nagaland. It was no more. There was never. It was never religious. It was more territorial. It was more geographical. While there was international support, like there was support from Burma, Myanmar at a point of time, and there's been support from China. But it's been a very covert kind of a support. It's not been an overt support, unlike in Kashmir, where the support was even overt and covert, of course. Right? Here, the support has always been under the radar. It's never you've never had someone from Myanmar or someone from China actually holding a gun and fighting over here. But in the case of Kashmir, we've had a whole lot of Pakistanis, a whole lot of Afghanis coming in, eliminated so many of them. So those are the difference. The fight in the Northeast at some stage was also very ideological, and there was a demographic divide between what those people felt in terms of India, as a society. Of course, today things have changed and they no longer feel like that. But the way the Northeast evolved after India got independence, probably we also dealt with them very casually and very summarily, the entire Northeast, which is why it was in such a state of uncertainty all these years. There was hardly any infrastructure development, there was very less education. We didn't venture out into those areas. That's why a whole lot of Baptists and whole lot of Evangelists and whole lot of missionaries landed up over there, educated, because the space was existing and it wasn't getting filled. So there was a demographic, there was an ideological divide, there was a divide in terms of what they felt, where they stood in terms of India and where they were. There was no communication. Politically, they did not have any representation. So all that is about the Northeast. J&K was absolutely different entity. J&K, I think a lot of it had to do with subversion, uh, psychological warfare. It also had to do with people really, the common man, not really knowing the reality and again getting diverted by Western interests like the politician. But very soon people realize that, it's the tide in Kashmir changed when the common man realized that it is uh, better to align with India than with Pakistan. And this is a much stronger country than Pakistan. And they could see the change happening. And when the government got serious about dealing with ground level problems, that is when things started changing.
Right. So, would it be right to say that when the motive behind a militancy is religious, like you mentioned in J&K, it becomes slightly more challenging to handle that situation?
See, a narrative is only as good as the truth is. What happens in J&K while the narrative was being built as a religion, but that religion, that marketing was done more in Afghanistan and Pakistan than actually in Kashmir. That Islam is in danger. That's how they could recruit the foreign militant. If Islam is in danger and you need to go and fight the jihad there to set the wrongs of the Muslims over here. That kind of marketing was done more in Pakistan and in Afghanistan uh, than actually in Turkey and than actually in Kashmir. While in Kashmir, there was, see, Kashmiris by nature, you must realize, are extremely mild, right? The religion that they follow is Sufism. And Sufism is one of the most mild forms of Islamic cultures. In fact, there's this fascinating story that once when Maharaja Hari Singh had to do a flag march in Srinagar with Kashmiri army, then Kashmiri army, he required the police for support because he thought that the flag march will not go well. So, that's how soft these guys are. So, mentally, Sufism is not a very fanatic form of Islam. The fanatism was created by certain elements to kind of fan the flames in Kashmir. But since the basic structure was Sufism, fanatics was only on the fringes. The fanatism that got doped into the Kashmiri society did not go down too deeply and could be dealt with. But at some point of time, despite the narrative saying that jihad, religion is under danger, Islam is under danger, it didn't last too long. It didn't really last too long. So it lasted for a while, but not very long. So I don't, and then the army and the government also kind of realized where this is going because psychological warfare needs to, it's a spectrum of warfare. So you have psychological warfare, you have intelligence warfare, you have actual operations, and every aspect of the warfare needs to be dealt with in its own way. So psychological warfare needs to be dealt with some aspect of psychological war. Communication warfare needs to be dealt. Financial warfare needs to be dealt in the same way. Financially. So the entire spectrum of warfare needs to be kind of tackled. You can't tackle everything with a gun. Some has to be done in its own form, in the form that you like.
Right. So, out of all your combat operations, right? Is there any operation that you'd like to tell us about which you felt was challenging, be it any part of India that you operated in?
I must tell you two interesting stories which in operation which will probably be fascinating. Um, One was an operation that we were doing near Surancourt, and there was this house which was under search, this village which was under search. And as we were searching house to house, there was a particular house where my team reached, and we were doing this room entry drill. And turn by turn, we were taking turns to get into the room, and the other two guys would cover. So we covered the first room, the second room, and then it was my turn to get into the third room. And as I touched the door to open it, I felt my hair stand up on my neck. And for some kind of a strong sixth sense and a gut feel telling me there's danger on the other side. I hadn't opened the door, I hadn't heard anything. So as I was opening the door, I took my AK-47 and I fired, and both things happened almost simultaneously. Probably a few bullets ricocheted off the door even before it had opened. And there was a militant sitting at the far end of the room. It was the longest room. And he too was bringing his weapon down. It was just a matter of seconds. I fired before he fired because I was already firing. And my burst got him in the chest. His two bullets, one bullet went through my cap. It was so close. So it's a matter of millionth of a second, and it was just my gut feel. Because my sixth sense told me there was something inside. I mean, he could have been a civilian, and I could have ended up killing a civilian. But I just took that chance, and I fired, and he fired back. But I fired faster. That was one interesting operation that I got, where I came very close to getting shot. I remember another operation where we were in a village, and we had got hold of this guy who was to give information and he used to supply weapons to various groups. He was like a distributor. He would get money and weapons, and then he would distribute. So we had got hold of this guy, and he was 65 years old guy. And he had been tied to a chair, and we were telling him, asking him, where do you give us information? And we knew he was, because we captured some stuff from him, and he wouldn't speak. So there were 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And we were getting restless, everyone was getting restless, and he wouldn't give information. And then suddenly there was this radio operator who was next to me. I don't know what got into him. All of a sudden, he hit me in my stomach with his elbow, and he pushed me to a side. And we both fell, and as we were falling, there was firing which came from top. There were three guys who were standing in a little hideout on top of us, and they were listening to all this. And suddenly one of them got trigger happy, and he just decided to fire. And they started firing. And this guy had not a sixth sense. I don't know, he heard the shuffle, he heard the cocking of the weapon. I don't know what he heard. He just pushed me, and the whole room was splintered with gunfire. Then, of course, we fired back, and we kind of shot them. And two of them fell down on the floor. But that was again very close. And this guy got a bullet injury in his leg. And they started firing, and he jumped over me. So he covered his leg over me, so part of the leg, but two bullets. So those two incidents I remember very closely, even now after all these years.
Right, so you mentioned about sixth sense, right? So I was like a couple of days ago, I was reading a book which mentioned the concept of being in a flow state.
Blink.
So
Have you read of the book Blink?
no, it's a different book. It's not Blink, but then it was also like explaining in terms of combat situations. So when a team operates, they sort of get connected because everybody in that team is in a flow state. So have you experienced that happening? Because Sixth Sense operates in
Many
that
times.
time. Yeah.
See, when you operate with with the men that you have, and you're operating in this tight situation, which is like a nuclear reactor.
Yeah.
You're in this high pressure situation. So after a point of time, you don't have to speak to each other. You know exactly what the man is thinking. He will just put up a finger and you know exactly what he's saying or what he's thinking or what he's seeing, right? It's like siblings, brother and sister or brothers or your mother. She just has to look at you and you know what the hell she's thinking or how she's going to fatka you, right? As a kid, that one look, you know what she said. She don't have to say it loud in a public place or in some relative's house. She'll just give you a look and you know exactly what she means and what she's saying. So it's exactly like that. I mean, you don't have to speak, and you know exactly what is happening, and because you've been through countless times together when you are in near death situations. And I think that pressure cooker situation creates kind of bonding which goes beyond the explanation of normal communications. I can't explain it. I can't explain. If you tell me now and ask me how does it happen, what are the mechanics, I can't explain it. But when you train together, you are morning, evening, night together, you're eating together, you're sleeping together, you are in these near death situations together, you're under pressure together. There is a kind of bonding and a syncing which goes beyond the fathom of natural communication. And that what keeps you alive sometimes. And the second thing I want to tell you about is gut feel. Like I told you, the situation where I kind of lived through because of gut feel. So and you will understand what I'm saying because it's not some foolhardy science. It is something very, very alive and something very, very true. So this book also talks about it that what is gut feel? Gut feel is like there's this pretty girl standing on a bus stop, and there are probably five men looking at her, and she understands that there are five men looking at her, but there is one man whose stare she's extremely uncomfortable with. She's okay with the rest of the four of them looking at her, but she's very uncomfortable with this one stare, right? That is gut feel. Because she knows this guy is not thinking right. Or when you walk into a room full of people and there are probably 10 people look at you, but there is one person you're very uncomfortable with. That is gut feel. As a kid, that gut feel is extremely strong in you. That's why most kids don't get hurt. Because naturally you are endowed, nature has endowed you with that kind of strength that you kind of listen to your body. You listen to what your mind is telling you. That's why extremely small kids will always protect themselves. They'll never be in places where there is danger. They'll curl up into a ball. They'll protect themselves. As you keep growing older, you start killing that sense of gut feel because you feel it's too easy. Because now you've experienced life and you've got educated and you say, yes, and you say, this is not the answer. So you will probably go to buy a shirt. You will like the shirt in the first minute that you walk into the shop, but you'll say, no, I don't like this. Because you will not accept what your mind is telling you. You'll probably go to 10 other shops and then you'll end up buying something and you'll come home and you'll say, Ajo, that first shirt I saw, no, I wanted that only. But it's too easy. That is gut feel. So in the services when you're into operation, that gut feel always comes up. And I've heard guys, I've been part of discussion where very interestingly, then officer is asking, a senior officer is asking a young officer, we'll do this. And he said, no, sir, we'll do like this. And he said, why? This is stupid. Why do you want to do this? He said, because my gut feel. I have no reason for it. And most times it comes true and it helps. So I think it's a very strong intuition and one must give into it and one must hone it. It is a natural sixth sense that has been God given to you. We kill it. I think it holds us in a lot of good stead.
Right. Also, happens because as adults we start obsessing about difficult things, right? If things are difficult, then only it's going to be the correct thing. Otherwise,
Then
it won't.
if it's easy, it's not the
If it's
correct
easy, it's
answer.
not right. Yeah.
We don't trust our own intuition.
Yeah.
We don't trust our own intuition, right? So many
Right.
times in the family, you're doing something, and someone, your mother or probably your brother or your wife or your father says, "Don't do that," and you see, don't even know about it. Why will you comment on it? My intuition tells me this is not correct, and you disregard that. You say, "Yeah, he doesn't know anything. He's not even heard this. He doesn't even know what I'm facing. How the hell can he comment on it?" That gut feel, right? And then
Right.
the words become prophetically true after a couple of months, and you see, I told you.
Right.
So yeah, we don't trust our own intuitions.
Yeah. Sir, how was your tenure as the commanding officer of three Grenadiers? How did your
Ex-
responsibilities change? Uh,
extremely, extremely. I was very proud, extremely proud, and see, as a commanding officer of a battalion, you have the power to change lives. Your one order will, you can have men dying at your command. That's the kind of power that you wield, and it gives you extremely proud feeling. So you are sitting on a throne of judgment for those 3 years that you are commanding. You are actually out of your. It's like an out of body experience because you are no longer the man that you were. You probably rise 5 times to the level that you are in terms of your thinking, in terms of how you think of command of your men, of your officer, what you can do for them, and how you want to leave a legacy. So it is an extremely challenging. It's challenging for yourself. You are kind of competing with yourself every day. How do I better myself, and how do I prove worthy of the unit that I'm commanding? And how do I leave a legacy behind? So I think those 3 years you give your mind, body, and soul to the unit, and you think, breathe. Everything of me was 3.5, 4 years was almost 4 years was three Grenadiers and nothing else. I couldn't think beyond that. I couldn't even think of my family. You're so driven, you're so consumed by that leadership. It is, and I think that happens to every commanding officer. You also carry the weight of your judgments and your decisions for yourself. So it's an extremely consuming position, and it's it's been recognized like that. If you speak to any of the generals, they will tell you that the best position or the best command they've ever had is that commanding officer to you. It's never a brigade commander, it's never a divisional commander. It is the commanding officer. Because the commanding officer, his personality is what envelops the battalion. He is the battalion, and the battalion is him. So he is not only the face, but the soul of the unit. It is extremely consuming, it is extremely gratifying, and it is extremely challenging and invigorating at the same time. There's
right.
a tremendous high you have. You're on fire, your hair are on fire.
Right. So as CEO, you also like you are a sponge basically. So you absorb pressure from the top and also from below. Can we say that when?
Yeah, you do because you don't want to pass down the pressure that you're getting
Yeah.
from top, pass them down. So you want to also set things right. So you want to set things right in your own way and not necessarily the things in the way that you have been told to do it. So a good commanding officer will always form that cushion, that kind of sponge, where he will absorb what has been given to him, but kind of ooze out only what he wants to in the way that he wants to. Every battalion has its own ethos. Every battalion has its own way of functioning. So he will set things right in the way that they need to be set right, and not necessarily in the way that he has been told. So That is, of course, one major aspect of how you are dealing with issues on a day-to-day basis. But you must also understand that as a commanding officer, you are not only responsible for the people on top, but you are so much more responsible to your battalion and to the men. So it's not only for those 3 years, but you also want to build that unit and leave a legacy behind. And you want to deal with traditions, and you want to deal with regimentation, and you want to deal with regimental history, and creating an ethos and training men and making sure that their career progression of the officers, of the men. So you're training them. And most of this will probably fructify or fruitify years later after you've left. So that's the legacy that you leave behind. So probably a team that you're building or an officer that you're training will actually start delivering much later, you know, when he becomes a major or a lieutenant colonel and you're training him as a captain. That is the legacy that you leave behind. That is where you are connected and you are answerable to your battalion, because people on top are from a different regiment or a different battalion. They will go away. For them, it's a position or a designation for that. But in your case, you're connected for life.
Yes. So you also led three Grenadiers to the UN, right?
Yes,
So how was that tenure there?
that was a very interesting role again, because we were part of the United Nations mission in Ethiopia, Eritrea. So the two countries had gone to war, and then there was a lot of bloodshed, and then the United Nations had kind of stepped in and formed a demilitarized zone. We were like a boxing referee between two boxers trying to keep two armies at bay, not knowing who would start punching and who would get caught in the middle. So there are these demilitarized zones stretching across the two countries, bordering the Red Sea. It is a very, very highly fragile and a highly active area, because how the Red Sea is. It finally leads into the Suez Canal and beyond, and one of the major shipping lanes and routes of the world go through this. So you have Syria on one side, and then you have the port of Aden and the Red Sea in between. We had Djibouti as a country on one side, which was a base for the French Foreign Legion and of the uh, American Marines, small country at the tip. And then you had Ethiopia, and then Eritrea. So this is extremely challenging. Even diplomatically, it was a great learning, because I was dealing with the Indian embassy in Addis Ababa. I was connected with the embassy in Kenya, because they were looking after Eritrea. I was also the senior most Indian official in Eritrea, with a small Indian community. Um, so it was a very challenging role and a very interesting role again. We had over 40 foreign countries, the mission, again from Europe and from Africa. There was a Jordanian battalion. My force commander was a Jordanian. The mission commander was from Cyprus. So extremely interesting tenure.
Right.
Very, very
So
interesting.
was writing still there in your mind when you were
I
in the
used to
army?
do military writing then. I used to do articles, but those were very flat kind of articles. Military writing, even if you write an article, and the article is very flat. The creative writing, what gives is when you go into, get into three dimensions and give it the depth, when character, emotions, dialogue happens. Otherwise, an article for a newsletter or an article for a magazine is a very flat piece. So I was doing articles in those days. Creative writing came much later after I hung my uniform. I didn't think of writing books at that point of time, but I thought that I had a flair for writing. That much I knew. So I used to do writing, but it never kind of. So sometimes you need a vision and a mission statement to get you going. And then that vision and mission statement came to me sometime after I'd left the uniform, and that confidence and the vision came to me that yes, I need to write. So when you have the writing on the wall and you have the mission statement before you, then of course things start
Right.
falling into place. If you ever leave life unattended or without a goal, you'll never achieve it. You have to set a goal and then things start falling into place.
Right, sir. Sir, so you mentioned that you had during your childhood grown up on stories, right? And in the army circles also, stories are what, like, when you join a unit, you're told about the stories of people who came before you, done great things. So does that have an impact when you think of writing
Majorly,
books as stories?
majorly, majorly. Like I said, I grew up hearing stories by my grandfather's knee, and he would tell me stories of the shikar and the hunts and the hunts during the tiger hunts during the Hyderabad police action. He told me stories of Italy, the Second World War, and then of course, so stories have fascinated me, and I grew into the art of telling stories. I think I learned from him. Uh, and then later, when I joined the army, and of course, then you hear stories. You're studying military history because it's part of the competitive, it's part of the promotion exams. Military history is a very integral part of army studies as a young officer. And then, of course, you these word of mouth stories of operations and of people and personalities and decorated soldiers. So those kind of stories do build up on you. They do build up into your experience, into your psyche, into your blood, into your genes. They kind of impact you profoundly, and they have. When I write, so like I said, when I write, say when I'm writing about Sudhir Walia, I'm hearing the narrative, but the entire emotion, the entire build, the fleshing out of the story comes from my brains and my own experience and my years of indoctrination being doped on these stories, on emotions, and that comes through in your writing. So while you would just tell me the narrative that, I went there and he was with me and this time, you're not really telling me the emotions, right? You're just narrating the story to me as a colleague or as a friend of Sudhir. You're just telling me the story. You're giving me details of the operation. But the emotions come through my own experience.
Right.
The build up, the fleshing out comes through my own understanding, through my years in the uniform, through my bonding with my own men. I know what the relationship between a young officer and a soldier is, between a junior commissioned officer who's much senior to you and a young officer is, how he looks upon him. How does the young officer look up to someone who's way senior to him but junior in rank to him? So those unique kind of bonds, those of course come after only deep understanding. And that's why I feel that there is this authenticity to the book which would come in. If I tell the story, if I tell a narrative to a civilian who's never been to Siachen, and I tell him a story about Siachen, he'll be able to factually get the story right, but he will not be able to recreate that story in the way that it needs to be recreated. Only someone who has been there, been shot at, like the story that I told you about the Siachen. Only if you've been through those emotions, if you experience that kind of emotion and that kind of atmosphere, will you be able to breathe fire into that story and emotion into that story. Otherwise, you need to experience it to get it right. You can't get it just because someone's told it to you.
Right. And this is applicable more so for combat stories, right? If you have not been there, done that, how would you be able to narrate it?
Correct. That's so. A lot of these stories, like probably say Wilbur Smith, when he writes his stories, because if you know, he spent long years in Africa. So that's why he's been able to get his stories on Africa so perfect, because he spent years in Africa. You had stories of like the other day I was reading about someone and they said that when someone sitting in Europe writes a story on India or a book on India, will he ever get it right? He can never get it right. It's only if you stayed in India will you be able to get it right. Like there are so many hues and so many parameters and such amazing dynamics that happen. A book like Shantaram, if you remember, that was written
Yeah.
because this guy stayed in India. He stayed in Mumbai. He stayed in the slums of Mumbai. He experienced it for himself. If he had stayed in Canada or California or Belgium and thought of writing, he could have never created a book like Shantaram. So you need to be in it to be able to create it. Otherwise, you will never get the perfection. You'll never get the authenticity. Right? Being an author and being a writer are totally different things. So you can study and get a management book out, right? You needn't be a CEO to actually bring out the management principle. You can be way down as and get out management principles for a CEO or how to get profitability in a company. That any writer can bring out. You don't have to really experience it. You just have to get the dynamics correct and you need to analyze it for yourself and get it right. You're not even answerable for what you're writing, so it's okay. Even if that guy doesn't achieve it as a CEO. But when you're writing emotional content and when you're writing, that's why when people write about romance, for example, so why do they say that poets who or people who kind of lost out on love will write the most amazing love stories, right? Because they have experienced it themselves. If you've never loved and if you've never lost out, how will you ever write a love story? Or how will you bring out that emotion? Similarly, adventure. You have to have some kind of a connect. You have to be an adventure freak. You have to have experienced something to get those actions right. Otherwise, you'll never be able to kind of bring out that stuff.
Right. So, the circumstances in which you are operating in or you're living, the days, also has an effect. So, I read somewhere that when J.R.R. Tolkien was writing Lord of the Rings, it's a fantasy, right? But the period that he was going through was not a good period.
Right.
He was able to write it. Similarly, for Game of Thrones, the period was good, but Game of Thrones was relatively more tragic
Correct.
in terms of fantasy. So, does that also play a role?
Yeah, I do think it does. It does. See, end of the day, how you set the book is a different art. Whether
Yeah.
you're setting it as a fantasy or as a period, that is a different. That's a different ballgame. But human emotions and human challenges will remain the same. So all these authors or all these people have captured the human emotion. They've captured the human dynamics. They've captured the politics and the power plays and the characters and the build up of the characters as they see it around them. They've just set them into a different era,
Yeah.
in a different context, into a fantasy land, into a fantasy kingdom. But if you see even Game of Thrones, and why was it such an amazing success? Was because that character might be wearing a sword and he might be riding a horse and he might be wearing his armor, but he thinks and politicizes and connives just like you and me,
Yeah.
like in the present day, right? So that is what, because the characters were so real. The manifestation of that character might be in the times that he is in. Obviously, he cannot, because he has to kill the guy in front of him with a sword or with a knife. He can't kill him any other way. But the way he thinks and the way the plotting is happening and way the internal dynamics are working is just like what happens today. So they have captured these emotions, these characters, and put them into a context. But unless you go through this and unless you understand uh, these dynamics, you cannot create an emotional drama like that. You cannot create emotional drama. Each of these characters has a connection with someone living today or dead. You cannot create a fictional character without you superimposing that character on someone who's already been there.
Right. So what is your writing process and how do you do research? Is there any set process that you have?
So, my writing process, as you keep writing as an author, you keep evolving. My writing process was when I started writing my first book, I had a hazy idea. And I started writing, I started creating characters, I started writing. And almost 7 months down the line, I realized that the book is going in all tangents everywhere because there were stories and there were stories and there were tangents and there were tangents. And I didn't know how to control it. And the characters had some power of their own and they were driving me in different directions. And the story was going absolutely haywire. I didn't know how to control it. It became like a bloody hydra and extremely difficult. So then someone told me, write the end. So I went and I wrote the end. And once I got the end correct, then I worked backwards. So that's how I could control the story because otherwise, when you are a new author, you don't really know the dynamics of writing and it was becoming voluminous. Normally, you publish at about 48,000 words. My first draft was 1,45,000 words. So the publisher told me, no way we can publish books like this. So they said, you have to cut it down by half. Cutting down by half means you slash the story half. You end up with a story which is like, which has got no head or tail because everything is there in those 140 words. The second book, of course, was a little more controlled because by now I had got the dynamics of writing. But then again, I built it. I had a skeleton. I had made an outline. I had a storyline because it was a historical story. So I had a I had a timeline to the story, but it was still a difficult process. The third book, by far, in terms of plotting the entire story, was easier, but getting it right has been this has been the most challenging and most difficult book of mine from the research point, from the factual point of view. So I had to first get the story in my head. How will I run the story? I formatted that in my head and then saw what is available and what is missing. And then wherever the missing parts were, I kind of went into research. Not everywhere I got stuff that I wanted. I had to leave out that and work on something else. It's like it's like when there's someone doing a movie and you go to a particular location. So he says, यार यहाँ पे ना 10 सीन यहीं शूट कर लेते हैं इस लोकेशन में. So you shoot scene number 1 and probably scene number 25 and scene number 45 all in the same place, right? Because certain things are available because there are 3-4 actors available. So the actor really doesn't know what the head or tail of the story is. He just told, yes, scene hai. This is what you got to do. He doesn't know the continuity of the story.
Right.
So even in my case, I did that. I was kind of writing some parts of the story. Whatever I could get on, whatever narrative I could lay my hand on, I said, let me complete this. So I had parts of the story built up, but there were large sections which were not connected. Then I had to fill them up. Some places, certain narratives I could not produce because obviously I was talking to people who were giving me a narrative which was about 25 years old. So I had to go back to maps and do a lot of self study and get those factuals right. I also didn't want to go wrong factually. You're talking about Sopur and I can't be talking about Srinagar. I, I had to get the facts correct. I had to get the geography correct. I had to get the narrative correct. I did not want to make it into a Bollywood masala where I could have written everything. And what would be the difference between me and a civilian author? I had to get the factual um, detailing correct, and yet I had to make it interesting. And yet I had to make it. I had to add a touch of glamour to everything that I wrote with conviction, of course. So that was the tightrope that I was walking continuously. Also, what happens is that when you're dealing with a military hero, in India, you always put a military hero on a pedestal. And you don't ever want to dent that image in any way, right? Through accident or through. an era of your writing. So I probably carried that weight and that responsibility throughout my writing. That I shouldn't in any way get into anything which will. I wasn't too scared of controversy, but I was very careful of making sure that his portrayal is perfect. While it needs to be in a military manner, it also needs to be factual and it also needs to be glamorized. But glamorized to an extent where it is acceptable and not beyond the realm of unacceptable. Acceptable.
Right. So, can you tell us about your first two books, The Curse of Magdala and The Tryst with Destiny, for people who don't know?
So the first book was Tryst with Destiny, Abhikrama. It is a
Yep.
political military thriller. I have juxtaposed military action and political intrigue, and there is so much of political intrigue around us. So I based it on UP politics, and I've based it on a lot of other politics, and I've created a narrative, I think, which is very fascinating. And there are also real characters because they are around us. So there are real characters in the book, and the book is a politico-military thriller. It also has 20 years of my own experiences. So, like I remember, there was this officer who is a friend of mine. He was in an operation in near Sorankot in Pir Panjar, and he uh, got injured in an operation. And I was that time staff officer close by. I got to know was his injury, and I could see this happening real time. And then there was a helicopter evacuation, and the helicopter did not have a place to land, so they prepared a dhok. Dhok are these shepherd huts up in the mountains, which are made of mud and log, and you don't know how much weight they will carry because they're old and some logs can crumble. So they prepared this dhok on which this helicopter landed and picked this guy up and took him away. Those pilots were so brave, they landed on that helipad because the rest of it was all slope and they could not find a helipad and they could not prepare one in quick time. So stories like this have come out in that first book and my own experiences. Second book, like I said, I kind of experienced it myself. I was there. I was there in Ethiopia, walking those same places, seeing the same places, seeing those cliffs, the sea, the sand, the tribes, everything. And the third book, of course, comes from my personal experience. So, The Curse of Magdala is a book again about the campaign into Abyssinia in 1868 by the British Army, by the colonial British Army, on the orders of the Empress of India, a dictate which comes from England. And the force sets sail from Mumbai in over 240 ships. They land up in Ethiopia. They travel across the entire country and attack the fortress of Magdala, where Emperor Tedros, which was a Christian kingdom in those days, they followed Orthodox Christianity. So he didn't know why the Britishers are attacking him. They get into a fight in which he is annihilated. The army puts up a very strong fight, but they unfortunately cannot match the colonial British army. Then Emperor Tedros shot himself with a pistol which was given to him uh, by the British monarch, an ivory butted pistol. He shot himself with that pistol. The army brought back his son to India. He grew up in India with Captain Speedy, who was his guardian, the gentleman I told you about. And then he was taken to England, finally died in England, like Prince Dilip, Maharaja Ranjit Singh's son, who also died. He was also a captive in England and as a prince who grew up in England. So he also died. His grave is still there uh, in England, in the Windsor Palace, outside the Windsor Palace. It's in the cemetery over there. He was never he was never taken and buried with the royals because he was an Ethiopian. There is a movement on in England called the Afromet, the Association for Return of the treasures of Magdala, because 270 camel loads of treasures came from Ethiopia, from transcripts to old Bibles to crosses to gold. Most of it has been strewn around in Europe. Some of it has come back. A cross was brought back by Second Grenadiers as a war booty. And every time the cross was taken out, there was something which went wrong in the battalion. So Indian soldiers kind of told the British officer that we don't want this. Please send it back. 1857 mutiny had just happened. So the Britishers were a little wary of the Indian soldiers at that time in 1868, 1869. So the cross was laid to rest in the Afghan church in Mumbai. The Afghan church incidentally came up in 1865, 1867 to commemorate the dead of the Afghan war which took place. So the church, the cross was laid in the church and then repatriated back to Ethiopia. A replica of that cross still exists in Second Grenadiers, but every time even the replica was taken out, something happened, and then there was a kind of a lore that this is cursed. So that became the seed for the book. So that is why it's called The Curse of Magdala, and that's how the horror came in. Otherwise, the characters, the places, the anecdotes, the stories are all true. There are a few hunts in the book. Those hunts are actually inspired by my grandfather's stories of his days and his hunts. So there is a lovely hunt of an elephant, and there is a lovely hunt of a panther, which is there. Both those stories are exactly true of my grandfather.
Right. Sort of like a beautiful culmination of whatever stories you've heard, whatever you've experienced.
Yeah, and also facts.
Also
you know.
facts, yes.
So there was a very interesting, when I was researching for the book, I found I had in the Prince and Albert Museum in England, there was this medal of a soldier, of an Indian soldier called Benny Israeli. And he was from Second Grenadiers. And it just blew my mind when I saw that medal. And that's when I came to know that there were Israeli soldiers in the Indian army. So Beni Israelis were Beni Jews were a tribe which had landed on the Konkan coast 1600 years ago. And they are part of the Raigad district. All along the coast they settled down. And then some of them figured out in the British army. There was also a set of another Jews who landed up in Mumbai. They are the Baghdadi Jews. The Sasson docks and the Sasson library and all has been made by the Baghdadi Jews, Mr. Sasson, who were a rich lot of Jews who had to do nothing to do with these Beni Jews, who were an improvised lot of Jews. So there are two sets of Jews who had come into India, the rich Jews and the poor Jews. So the rich Jews built Mumbai and the poor Jews figured out in the army. Now, of course, a lot of them have left. As I visited graveyards of these Jews in the Raigad district, I met one guy who speaks absolute Marathi, looks like a Maharashtrian, but he's a Beni Israeli. He runs a Shalom driving school in a small place called Pain. And he said that there are few of us still left over here. So it's a very fascinating story and a very fascinating book. And my research took me to such fascinating areas.
Right. Like you correctly mentioned, right? A person who is not from India, it's very difficult for him or her to write a book on India because it's so many cultures, so complex. You will only if you stay here for a while, for a prolonged period of time, will be able to write a
True.
good description. Yeah. So when you were writing a book about Major Sudhir Walia, sir, so were there any stories that you came across that you'd like to mention that had an impact on you?
Actually, each of your stories is very fascinating. From the from the time that the attack on Zulu Top during Kargil. So he led the last attack on Zulu Top in Kargil on Zulu Top. After that, ceasefire was declared. So his claim to fame in Kargil is the last attack in Kargil. And after Tiger Hill and the other features had fallen, the enemy had kind of concentrated on this feature called Zulu Top, and that's when they had to be evicted. So he led the last attack. It was a very fascinating attack, which has never been actually recorded in the fashion that I have brought it out. Then there are also some very interesting operations because they used to also carry out certain covert pseudo operations. While there has been whisperings about these operations, they've never really been brought out on paper. Probably the first time such operations have actually come out, where some of these para teams impersonate as militants and operate to kind of get a strike with the militants so that they can kind of leave. So those are the fascinating bits which have actually come on, which have only been spoken about in very, very controlled terms, but never been spoken about. But now that so much time has passed, I think we can talk about these things. We should not talk about it. And of course, the last operation. There was a very interesting operation where there were three officers. He and there was another officer in 9 Para who got the Ashok Chakra called Arun Jasrotia.
Yes.
Again, very brave and a very, very illustrious officer. So Sudhir and Arun Jasrotia were the same operations. And Arun died in that operation. So even that operation is, I think I did a fairly good job of that chapter. Where they both in that operation and he dies. And then, of course, his last operation in Afruda, where he himself died. There's incidentally a boy who's writing a book on Arun Jasrotia even as we are speaking. So he was very proud and privileged to share my book with him, and he said, so I'm keeping this as a reference for his book. But you must also know that, when you write stories like this, Sudhir Walia was not Sudhir Walia only because he was not a Rambo by himself. He was not a Superman, right? He was a human being like you and me. He had the same aches and pains like you and me had. He was a human end of the day. I have tried to evolve that. I have tried to deal with him as a young man that he was, having his own aspirations, having his own insights and his own aspirations for life. But I've also, so while I've done that, I've also recreated the men around him, at least some of them, who stood by him, who were with him through thick and thin. I've created their stories too. So I think that is why this book is so interesting because it's not only him but his entire team of people. There's a gentleman called Honorary Captain Mahindra Singh, Kirti Chakra, Sena Medal, who was injured with a spinal injury. He has a bullet injury in his spine, who's coming down for the book launch. He spent years with Sudhir Walia, another very inspiring man. Then there is Honorary Captain Mukhtar, Shaurya Chakra. So there are men like him who've been with Sudhir. And I have got all these characters in and I have created those characters around Sudhir. That is what makes the story so fascinating. So it is not only Sudhir, Sudhir, Sudhir. Of course, there is him and there is his daredevilry and his exploit and his leadership. There are all these other men also. Arun Jasrotia, like I said, Major Bhushan, Nirmal Dhaliwal, some of these officers, and of course the men who have operated with him. And that gives a very 360-degree arc to the story. And that's what authenticates the story.
Right. So why was Rambo as the name of the book? Was there in your mind from the start, or you decided on it after you finished it?
From day one, the day I wrote the synopsis, in fact, I called it Rambo. Even my first page, the first time I started writing, the first word that came to my mind was Rambo. And that has stuck. It was the first word that I ever wrote. See, he was known as Rambo for his
Yeah.
daredevil by a small group of people, but they did nickname him that. And I think he, in the truest form, he exemplifies that word in a much better way than Sylvester Stallone could ever do. And it's also a very fascinating. It's a very fascinating name for a book. Uh, so, in all perspectives, I think it just fitted in well, and it shows from the kind. My book yesterday. I was looking at Amazon, and I was pleasantly surprised by my publisher telling me that it's become the number one bestseller in military encyclopedias even before it got released. That was very gratifying. So I think that name somewhere resonates and kind of captivates you, and you want to pick up and see what this all about. Why Rambo? So the first thing that comes to you is Rambo because of the Rambo that has become famous, but it also intrigues you to pick up the book.
Right.
If I had put in any other name, hero of so and so or tiger of so and so, all those things have already been used, and I didn't want something which has already been beaten. I wanted something which is absolutely new, captivating, gripping, and something which will make you reach out for the book. I think this just makes you reach out for the book. It's simple, it's crisp,
Yes, sir.
it embodies the man that he was, and it defines the book and the story.
And about time the story came out, like uh, with
In
details,
but
and yeah,
I have also dealt with the story in a very military way.
yeah,
So I haven't dealt while I have written about the family in brief, but like there's a difference. Like if you talk about Uri movie, like Uri, it's a very military movie, right? It's not so much about song and dance and family. So I didn't want to go into those aspects. I wanted a very military book to be written, a cinematic book, but a very military book. So that was the brief that I gave myself, and that is the brief that I stuck to. So I have not wavered from that brief, and I've kept it very, very focused on the military aspects of the story,
right.
which is what any reader would want actually. Average man wouldn't really want to know what happened to him when he's 3-year-old or 4-year-old, unless it has a bearing on him in some way. But I don't have to go into details of his childhood. I felt that I would do greater justice by bringing out the military aspects of the story
Right.
for what he
Because
won.
and from what I have known about his early life, what he did when he was in the army, you'll not be able to connect the dots if you only knew about his early life, right? You cannot
See,
extrapolate that.
his early life, his growing up years, which I think there are 1 or 2 books written about him like that.
Yeah.
Frankly, with all due respect to him, have not been exemplary. I mean, they have been like they would be for any score of other young officers who joined the army, for me or for anyone else, right? He was in the Scenic School, he was in NDA. So, all that is, he's just like any other cadet who was there. There is nothing extraordinary about that part of his life which will make you sit up and, it's like someone goes and fights a lion and gets a bravery award, or someone goes and fights a bear and gets a bravery award on 26 January, like those brave children. That's an exemplary act. So that is what something you would love to hear. But if your life is routine, getting into those aspects of his life doesn't add value to what he has done later. In fact, it I feel it takes away the sheen from what he's done later. So, what is the glamorous part? What is the greatest achievement of his life? I need to highlight that, and I need to keep that focused. If I add more layers to it, it will take away that glamour, the success, that focus from that part of his life, which needs to be told. So, I didn't want that any kind of other clouding happening. That's why I kept the story very, very controlled and very focused.
Right. So, things are really looking forward to the book.
You want me to read
Uh,
a para from this book?
sure, sir. Absolutely, if you can.
Okay, let me read a small para from the book.
Yes, sir.
Sri Lanka. Sea, Sacrifice and Blunders. Operation Pavan. Vavuniya, October 1988. The humid, balmy weather lulled the young subaltern to sleep. They had left the brilliant blue of the Indian Ocean, the powder soft sands, and the idyllic palms 2 hours back. The road meandered through deep jungles now. Perched in the truck, Sudhir could see his senior, the captain in the jeep leading the convoy. Jolted out of his wistful thoughts by the sounds of automatic fire and the thump of motors from across the lagoon, Lieutenant Sudhir heard the deafening crescendo of 57 millimeter rockets fired in a shallow dive. Black smoke billowed over the treetops as an acrid smell hung in the air. Peering out of the army truck, he noticed the Mi-8 gunships circling like vultures. The Indian Air Force gunships were hunting the LTT in the tropical jungles. Suddenly exploding glass shards cut his face, the staccato sound of machine gun fire accompanying the rush of air through the shattered windshield. He eyed flashes from the deep undergrowth across. Holding up his arm to protect his face, he saw the driver's head jerk back, split open. The truck wheeled sharply, hitting a tree. Sudhir stumbled out, dazed, seeking protection against the truck. Fire! Fire! The captain's voice barked. Fire! Cocking the rifle, Sudhir fired randomly. The first shots hit a tree. Shoot those fucking bastards, not the fucking trees, the captain yelled. Studying his arms, Sudhir tried to aim for the flashes. Before he could fire effectively, the fight was over. The LTD tigers had silently melted away in the deep forests after the ambush, leaving a carnage. The air smelt of burnt tires, brakes, and spilt gasoline. The captain walked up and looked down at Sudhir, tapping him on the shoulder. This is bandit country. Think like a bandit. Always be ready to hunt and stop gaping like a tourist. Sudhir nodded, a lesson he would never forget in his life. Removing the cork with his mouth, the captain took a swig from his hip flask and held it out to Sudhir. Welcome to Vavonia. Holding the army issue flask encased in canvas, Sudhir wrinkled his nose as he took a sip of the sour smelling water. Worry about staying alive first, then worry about how to live, you bugger. Sudhir learned his second lesson in life, that too from someone who was barely a few years older than him. This is what war did to boys. It made them men much
Happening.
less than a kilometer away. Men were still fighting and dying. The LTT had ambushed a company of Gurkhas on patrol. In the hand-to-hand fight that ensured heavy casualties had occurred, IF's lethal Mi-25 Hepter gunships unleashed 23 cannon fire, 56 rockets, and 500 kg high-explosive bombs against the Tigers. A lone army Cheetah helicopter circled above, an air observation post picking targets and directing fire. Reinforcements were required to be flown in before dusk, so some Mi-8 gunships were diverted off in a quick lift-off, flying low over the jungle to pick up the soldiers of the Mahar battalion from their camp. They flew back into the battle zone, 20 fully armed soldiers on each sortie, with the Mi-8s setting up a virtual air bridge. The lost sortie brought in the tough men of the 9 para commandos. Bavonia was the headquarters of the 4th Infantry Division. It had earned a reputation as a red flag Eagle Div during the World War II. Bavonia also had the tactical headquarters of the 9 para SF. Soon it got dark, but the sounds of fighting went on till late into the night. So this is just a small glimpse of what has been done. This is a stint in Sri Lanka.
Yes, sir. Like you mentioned earlier, right? So then it transports you to any reader. It will transport to the place where all this is happening. So going to be an amazing read, sir. Yes, sir. So what? So how is life post retirement, sir? And why did you think of taking a premature retirement?
So, like I told you, that I also I'll come back to this book again. There's some.
Yeah, sure.
I'll deal with your question first. So I always wanted to live on an edge. And after I had commanded my battalion and after I had done my bid, I think my days of being with the men and being in command, the commanding third Grenadiers was a tremendous high, and I don't think anything else would have ever matched that high.
Yes.
I would have got my ranks. I would have probably retired. I don't know whatever rank, but it wouldn't really have given me that. I didn't want to dilute that taste. I wanted to leave the army at a time when I was at the zenith. And of course, I was also looking for other challenges. And that's how I left. And then I kind of joined Leela's at a point of time, which was good. A lot of glamour. But my heart was not into all that. And then from there, I went into Go Air, which is extremely challenging again, very exciting because I was running all India operation. But you're always on the edge for the wrong reasons. Then I joined Imagica. I joined them when they were in the project stage, and I stayed with them for 10 years. It was for 4 years the CEO and another 2 years as the Chief Operations Officer. I was on the board. It was very gratifying and extremely humbling tenure. I mean, to have left the army and then being picked up to be a CEO of a 1600 crore company, I think was very, very humbling. Also a recognition of what I stood for. And Mr. Shetty, who kind of started the company and who was the founder, recognized that strength, gave me the opportunity. He's the one who is synonymous with Ad Labs. So very old name and a very recognized and revered name in the film industry. Old-time producer. He started the Ad Labs laboratories. He brought in the multi-dome theaters in India. He's the man who brought in the multi-screen concept into India. Earlier, we used to have only single-screen theaters. He was the man who brought in the concept of multi-screens, the entire revolution. So I worked with the Magica, and then, of course, I graduated. What I want to tell you about this book is, one interesting fact about this book is, since I was in the UN, I also had friends in the UN and some Pakistanis who were also civilians who were there, and certain army officers who had relinquished the uniform. So I also wanted the other side of the story. Now, unfortunately, if you pick up any book in India by anyone, there is only one side of the story. What you saw, what you felt, what happened on your side of the border. I wanted the other perspective. And luckily for me, I got that other perspective through some amazing books, which were given to me because of my contacts in the US. And that gave us such a different context to the whole thing. And similarly for Kashmir, I wanted the other story to be brought out. And I couldn't get hold of the other perspective. I spent years there. So I had to tap some of my old sources over there. And I had discussions with them. And then I got hold of some books. And that gave me a very insightful detail into the Kashmiri thinking and the details of how the Kashmiri society was feeling and the change and the metamorphosis that was happening in the society, which forms parts of the book. So while I'm dealing with Sudhir Walia, like I told you, there are other friends and his colleagues and postmates I'm talking about. But I'm also talking about this other thing that are happening around him, which an integral part of the story, because the circumstances in which he operates are also because of the reality that exists around him, right? It's not in isolation.
Right.
So those aspects have been brought into the story and into the narrative, which I think make it a very fascinating read. And I'd like to give you an insight into that if you have the time and if you can get into a little part.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Absolutely.
The Islamic Caliphate. कश्मीर रहना है, Allah Akbar कहना होगा. The sound of chatter filled Sudhir's ears as he walked down the once bustling street of saffron shops and dry fruit sellers. The air was crispy and chilly, causing him to pull his jacket closer around him. The pavement beneath his feet felt unyielding and hard. Small wet stones jutted out, scraping against his shoes. The street smelt of burnt wood, smoke, and kebabs. As Sudhir rounded the corner, a wistful smell of freshly baked bread drafted towards him from the quaint bakery. His watering mouth made him realize he hadn't lost his childhood memories. It brought a smile. Sudhir saw a familiar figure walking up through the crowds towards him. It's been a while, Sudhir. Aslam warmly shook hands. You look more Kashmiri now. I do, don't I? Smiling, Sudhir stroked his beard. I see progress. Sudhir looked past his glass window of an internet cafe. Fresh problems. Sudhir furrowed his brow in confusion as Aslam motioned him to follow. Aslam led him to a small tea shop. The cramped space made it impossible to avoid touching knees with the person across from him. The table was sticky, the chairs worn and creaky. Online radicalization from the internet. Aslam looked round. He leaned closer before muttering, These kids rushing to encounter sites, a safe passage to hold up militants, all subverted, fooled. Sudhir looked at Aslam with newfound interest. Aslam spat out, poor wretched kids. Gulping the hot tea, they stepped out to continue the conversation. Taking in the sensory chaos of hanging wires and narrow lanes, Sudhir couldn't help but feel a sense of nostalgia wash over him. This was Srinagar, he had to remind himself, not Palampur. The Wahhabis, the Tabligis, the Jamatis are competing in establishing madrasas. Aslam continued. They seduce kids from poor families. This, this Islamization is all imported? Aslam nodded. The text of Islamic studies is being radicalized. No need to go across to Azad Kashmir now. Everything is available here. POK, Sudhir corrected. Aslam nodded. Yes, POK. So what kind of influence? Sunni, Maududi, who knows? But surely Sudhir interrupted. People can see through it. Stop it. Ignoring Sudhir, he continued. Exhibitionist Islam, a Kashmiri rituals and Sufism killed by Arabic culture. He stopped and spread his arms wide. An entire generation of semi-literate zombies who identify more with Islam than with Kashmir. Why can't you stop it? An irritated Sudhir was abhorred by their lack of intent. Aslam ignored him again. Instead, he took Sudhir to the martyrs' graveyard in the Idgah area of downtown Srinagar. Come, see before you question, okay? He glared at Sudhir. Check this out. Aslam walked to two tombstones. One of the local separatist politicians seeking Azadi from India, and the other of his own murderer, a Hizbul Mujahideen militant fighting Kashmir's accession to Pakistan, both buried next to each other. Sudhir's mouth hung open in amazement as he stared in fascinated dismay. See, that's how fucked we are. A confused lot. We don't know fuck about what's happening. Taken aback, Sudhir's eyes widened when he heard what Aslam implied. New black shrouds have replaced Pakistani green flags as crimins to wrap martyred terrorists on their funerals. Sudhir's irritation grew as he heard Aslam use the word martyr instead of slain or killed. A minor detail, but it irked him. Although Sudhir recognized the complexity of the situation in Kashmir, he believed it was crucial to reveal the truth. Jihad in Kashmir is no longer about ISI, Pakistan, or Azadi, muttered Aslam under his breath. The words tasted bitter on his tongue. It's about the Caliphate. Sudhir's face was frozen in shock. Aslam's face turned crimson. You asked why we can't stop this? Who will stop this? You? He screamed at Sudhir accusatively. A stupefied Sudhir was too stunned to speak. Our politicians failed us. New Delhi failed us. Aslam breathily forced out his words. Sudhir had never seen Aslam so angry, so distraught. He chose to remain silent. The anguish we endure rips our souls. Aslam's voice trembled with emotion. Our homes are smoldering ruins, our children's innocence twisted, the very essence of a culture fading into obscurity. To Delhi, we are merely sympathizers, and the militants think us as informers. Sudhir allowed his silence to speak. Aslam's words hung in the air like a shroud, and we can't do a fuck about it. His blazing argument, born of deep frustration, ignited like a spark in the dry chinar leaves. Don't just talk, be earnest. Either do something drastic or lose Kashmir forever. Remove Article 370, Sudhir asked suggestively, finding his voice. Grinding his teeth, Aslam just picked a rock and hurled it with all his might, all the might of his pent-up despair. Aslam's rage drove Sudhir to stare at grave after grave, goading him to find the answers himself. That's the kind of research that has gone into this book.
Right. It sort of builds the story from like all angles. Right.
Yeah. So it's not just one-sided anecdote. It's not.
Insight into what is happening in that area where he was operating. So people get a full picture of what happened.
For someone who's sitting, like for example, in Bangalore, or someone sitting in Kochi, Kodaikanal,
right,
but he doesn't know. So there are so many aspects of this book which a lot of people who really haven't been in that era or in that situation wouldn't know the transformation that is happening, the kind of forces at play that happened over there. How things are. They only heard कि वहाँ पे ना army versus militant terrorist झगड़ा चलता था. That's all you know. But this churning of the society that is happening, no one knew this. The Islamicization, the Caliphate, how ISI went into an oblivion, something else come up. So these kind of dynamics that play into the society, into the Kashmiri mind, that a lot of us are not aware of.
So most of it was happening in early 90s. Yes. Most of us weren't even born then. So we don't have any picture of what happened actually.
It's past and you don't even kind of rake it up.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
But that is so fascinating. Imagine a politician and his murderer both there.
Yeah.
In the same graveyard.
Exactly.
Both in the martyr's graveyard. One because he's become a martyr because he died. The other guy because he's been shot and he's a martyr in his own right in their eyes.
Right, sir. Absolutely. So is there a plan to publish this in multiple languages later on?
Well, I've had a talk with the publisher. Let's see. This is stage one, and I'm sure we would want to publish it. It's an elaborate process. So
yes,
that's the call that the publisher will take. But I personally feel that it should at least come out in 2-3 major languages.
Right.
For people to really understand them, because there's so much of effort has gone in, and so much of realism is in the story that it needs to come out.
Yes, it should reach as many people as possible.
Yes.
So, any final thoughts that you'd like to tell our viewers on the book?
So I always have this last thought, and a lot of people have asked me this, and I want to leave you with that thought. My mission has been to bring to life heroes and bring their stories and their sacrifices to the man on the street and to the young adults. And like I have said in the book, in my foreword, if this book inspires one boy out of 130 crore Indians to rise up into another Sudhir Walia, the story will find redemption. That's what my mission is. And I'll leave you with that thought.
Yes, right. Thank you so much, sir, that you took out time to speak to us. It was absolutely great speaking to you, and I'm sure that a lot of people will learn a lot from the book and from this podcast. So, thank you so much. We are really looking forward to that book, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure talking.